If you can handle that, then you're in good shape. This is a subject I've been interested in for years. It's not about the beauty of the body of our classic cars, the aesthetic charms of a car, or the beautiful interior we have. It's not even about the engine. It's about something most of us never talk about. How does the power from that engine get to the wheels and make the car go? I'm going to talk to you tonight about developments in automotive drivetrains that have made cars pleasant to drive today. They weren't always that way. I've been researching and writing about this subject for many years, and last year the Classic Car Club magazine published an article which is a lot of the substance of what I'm going to tell you tonight on that subject. And they even gave me an award for it. I'm not sure what was going on there, but at any rate, I'm going to take you back through history. No, there won't be a quiz at the end of the hour, but you can sort of look at it as a required English course, a freshman English course or something. Something that's good for you, but you got to take it, but you probably wouldn't volunteer to do it. So this is basic knowledge that I think you'll find, I hope you'll find interesting. So here we go. Again, anytime as we go along, don't hesitate to stick your hand up, ask a question. What do you mean by that? Because I don't want to leave you behind. When we get to the point where at least 25% of you are nodding, we'll end the talk. There will be no slides though, so. Well, during the brief span of the decade of the 1920s, the automobile went from being a plaything of auto enthusiasts and the well-to-do to being a pervasive and essential part of nearly every American life. That happened in that one decade. The appeal of greatly enhanced personal mobility brought by the automobile, coupled with the unique genius of the American auto industry in making cars affordable to a wide spectrum of the citizenry, proved irresistible. But all of this popularity was not because cars of the day were particularly easy to drive. The challenges for a new motorist in the 20s were daunting, even if she or he could afford to buy a car. The acceleration was snail-like. It was slow. Hardly any cars moved briskly down the road. Bulky transmissions caused you to crash and clash the gears every time you shifted. You had to be a real pro to shift gears without making a spectacle of yourself. You had to learn to double clutch to shift smoothly. And we've forgotten that, but all cars were like that. You had no choice. There were no automatic transmissions. That's what I'm going to be telling you about as we go along here. Brakes were only on two wheels, and well, I could go on. They were not very civilized conveyances. And that was began to be of concern to the automobile manufacturers because they felt they could expand the market greatly if they could make driving more pleasant, if they could improve the drivability of cars. As mechanical reliability improved, the auto manufacturers really began to look seriously at how they could make that happen. The need to shift gears and manipulate the clutch was probably the most difficult challenge for the first-time motorist of the 20s. And I have to say that today it still is a difficult challenge. I've run into more and more people today, young people, who have never driven a manual shift car. They don't know how to manipulate a clutch. They don't understand that basic concept of connecting the engine to the transmission and learning that there's some skill involved in it. I think it won't be too many years before you just won't be able to get a straight standard shift car. But don't get me started on that. I love shifting for myself. Many of the mechanical improvements that were soon to come, we're in the late 20s now, were done in the name of making it easier for women to drive, but that's a sexist view of the world as it was then. First, there were a great many women who quickly learned to be as mechanically capable as they needed to be to operate automobiles, and for whom a reluctant transmission was but a temporary deterrent. Secondly, there was a vast horde of bumbling men who welcomed any development that eased shifting chores just as eagerly as women. In short, there was growing pressure from the marketplace to make driving easier. So our focus here will be on efforts the automobile industry made to improve transmission performance, gear shifting, and clutch tending. And second, eventually by eliminating or greatly reducing declutching and shifting by the driver in everyday operation. The first significant development in this industry effort to make driving easier was the synchronized or synchromesh transmission, Now, I think you're all familiar with that. That's probably the only kind of transmission you've driven in your lifetime, our careers. It was introduced by GM on Cadillacs in 1929. It was a real breakthrough. Synchromesh provided a mechanism to bring the gear that was about to be engaged in the transmission up to speed prior to actually sticking the two gears together in the gear train, thereby eliminating clash and grind as the teeth of the two gears meshed. For many decades, synchronizers were applied only to second and high gears, but eventually in the 60s were extended to first and even reverse. Synchromesh gears were developed by an inventive young engineer named Earl Avery Thompson. Aware of the difficulty most drivers had with double clutching in order to effect smooth shifts, Thompson had developed a synchromesh system by the early 20s. Well, double clutching, I think I mentioned that. That means when you start shifting from first to second, for example, you pause in neutral, let the clutch out, blip the gas to bring the gears. You've engaged all the gears at that point, but you're in neutral. But you're bringing the gears up to speed, and then the trick is pushing the clutch back in at just the right RPM rate of the engine, and then shifting on into the next gear. Well, you can do that pretty well with practice, but a lot of people never did master the technique. So synchromesh eliminates the need to do that. Well, he chopped this idea of his all over Detroit, trying to get manufacturers interested enough to buy it from him, but he couldn't get anybody interested. They all thought it was a good idea, but they were concerned about the cost and concern over durability. And in the 20s, it was a boom time. They were selling all the cars they could make. The industry was in a growth mode, so there was a reluctance to spend money on something that wasn't instantly produced a bottom line. Finally, in late 1924, Cadillac division took the plunge and brought the patent rights from Thompson, hired him as an outside contractor for good measure. It was the start of a prophetic history-making relationship. Thompson had some ideas about designing a fully automatic transmission as well, and went on to lead the GM team that eventually developed Hydramatic, the first successful fully automatic transmission. Over the next 4 years, Thompson and Cadillac Engineering developed 4 variations of Thompson's ideas for synchromesh, always with the goal of reducing manufacturing costs without impairing performance. Thompson's basic concept involved the addition of synchronizing rings, which brought up the speed of gears about to be engaged for clash-free engagement. Finally, synchromesh was deemed ready for release, and it was introduced on the 1929 Cadillacs and LaSalle's. It was an immediate success, and the rest of the industry soon followed. By 1932, it was available on 22 of the 78 model lines offered by the industry that year, including all 9 GM lines. GM is General Motors, of course. I'm sure you all are up to speed with that. Synchromesh eventually spread to virtually every make of car. I want you to know, I want to give you comfort in this. I'm leaving a lot of stuff out, the less important stuff. So, well, the next innovation to be adopted throughout the industry, in the interest of easy driving, was freewheeling. How many of you remember freewheeling? Well, see, boy, there's a lot of old people here. No, I'm just kidding. When freewheeling was engaged, the car coasted with the engine disengaged from the drive shaft whenever the accelerator was released. In other words, as soon as you let up on the gas pedal, it was just like you'd pushed in the clutch. But you hadn't pushed in the clutch. An overrunning clutch, a different kind of a clutch, in the transmission, separated the drivetrain, the drive shaft from the engine. The engine speed then dropped to idle when you let up on the gas, which saved, quote, saved fuel, saved oil, saved wear and tear on the engine, or so the advertising claims went. But economy was not the only reason advanced at the time in favor of freewheeling. Introduced by Studebaker July 10, 1930 on its 1931 models, the device was also promoted as a means to make gear shifting smoother and even permit shifting without use of the clutch. Better gas mileage was usually mentioned, but seldom as the principal reason for freewheeling. This is something I've looked through some of my old catalogs where they see what they have to say about freewheeling, and it's interesting. It isn't just an economy device. It was to make driving easier. Shifting was smoother, It was clash-free even if your car brand did not yet have synchromesh. And one really could shift without the clutch. I know, because I've got my 35 Lincoln has freewheeling, and you can tool around town and it shifts much easier. You can shift between first and second high, back and forth. It's smoother even though the car has synchromesh, and it is pleasanter to drive. But of course you've got this, the engine drops to an idle and you have no engine braking. That's the drawback. And when you come to a stop, you have to put the clutch in because you can't shift into first gear when you're stopped if you don't have the clutch in. Well, at the lower speeds in urban areas, the lack of engine braking was not a problem. If hills were encountered, freewheeling could be locked out without stopping the car. The device consisted of a relatively simple overrunning clutch and a button on the gear shift or a lever on the or pull knob on the dash controlled engagement. But I think, how many of you have a Classic which has freewheeling in your garage? Oh, there's one. Okay. Do you ever use it?
I do.
6 months after Studebaker introduced freewheeling, Pierce Arrow, Lincoln, Auburn, and Hupmobile had adopted it. Freewheeling swept the industry by 1932, but was gone almost as quickly. By 1936, it had virtually disappeared from U.S. option lists, but not before it had reached the specification tables of at least 12 makes of cars by 1934. In those where it remained, it was sometimes combined with overdrive, which was then just arriving on the scene about 1936. Studebaker by that year was bragging about having introduced freewheeling and now how freewheeling had made possible the development of overdrive. And there's a relationship there. I'm not going to go into that today. But after 1936, freewheeling disappeared except as part of overdrive. It was, for those of you who have had an overdrive car, it's a handy device. Overdrive cars freewheel below the overdrive cut-in speed. That is the speed where you can lift the gas and go into fourth gear. It's not quite total freewheeling. But as I say, we're not going to bother with that today. Now, the Depression was a tremendous spur to innovation and product improvement for the automobile industry. That was from 1930 to 1940. And transmissions and clutches were a major area of focus. Again, they're seeking new ways to broaden the market appeal of the automobile. And the engineers of Detroit were on a roll and were coming up with more devices to make driving easier, or so they thought. The second major device that was tried in the 30s was the automatic clutch. And again, I didn't realize the automatic clutches were widely available in the early 30s cars. Not so much in the Classics, but in some everyday bread and butter cars. The automobile, developed by Bendix, the automatic clutch became an option on several makes about 1932. A vacuum-powered cylinder activated by solenoids disengaged the clutch whenever the accelerator was released and the engine speed dropped to idle. The effect was similar to freewheeling, with one significant difference. The vacuum clutch would also disengage automatically when coming to a full stop. Then when the traffic light changed, the driver could select first gear and motor off, all without pushing in the clutch pedal. The clutch would be engaged automatically whenever the accelerator pedal was depressed. In other words, the engine speed was brought up. The clutch actuation was linked to the accelerator linkage and had to be carefully synchronized to work smoothly. As the clutch wore or the state of the engine tune deteriorated or the controls and switches just plain got dirty and out of adjustment, clutch smoothness would deteriorate. At that point, rather than try to fix it, most owners would just switch off the device and forget about it, because you could do that always. In addition to maintenance, what ended the brief automatic clutch vogue was that drivers came to realize that perhaps gear shifting was a bigger chore than clutch tending. But the automatic clutch did nothing to reduce the need to shift, or perhaps just as important, help decide when to shift. I think a lot of motors had problems deciding when they had to downshift. They tended to lug their engine. They didn't, not like us car guys, we listen to that engine if it's laboring or working and giving us signals that it's being lugged, it bucks, we shift down. But a lot of everyday drivers didn't have that sensitivity. Between 1933 and 1935, the automatic clutch was offered on a number of marques. In 1934, which was perhaps the high watermark, it was available on all of the Chrysler Corporation cars, that is Plymouth, Dodge, DeSoto, and Chrysler, as well as Auburn, Hudson, Terraplane, and Stutz. But aside from Buick, no GM car ever offered an automatic clutch, nor did Ford. But this is for Buick fans. Buick had its own unique idea here.
You're the only one here.
It's all for you? Can we step outside? I'll tell you this right. Buick developed a device in 1932 which they called the Wizard Control. Even then they were getting into fancy, meaningless names for something that they decided was special. Buick offered what they purported to be freewheeling, but actually Buick took an automatic clutch and rigged it to perform just like a freewheel unit. As long as the driver kept a foot on a floor button, which was next to the clutch, but it was just a small button like a dimmer switch, once the driver got going, he could have the automatic clutch on. He kept his foot on that button, then the automatic clutch would function. That is, it would disengage the clutch every time he took his foot off the gas, or she. Well, this gave the effect of freewheeling without the cost of installing a freewheel unit on the transmission. Wizard Control, of course, had the added advantage of not requiring the driver to depress the clutch when bringing the car to a complete stop. There was another unique advantage. Anytime there was a desire to return to direct drive, and have engine braking back, for example, the driver just switched off the device by sliding his foot off this little button. It would pop out, and bang, your clutch was engaged all of a sudden. It was in a car with conventional freewheeling, the driver had to move a lever on the dash to take it out of freewheeling. Well, Buick, this was a Buick's variation on craze for both freewheeling and automatic clutches right at the same time. It was sophisticated enough to actually provide for a more gradual clutch engagement when starting from rest, as compared to shifting between the higher gears when getting underway. But the automatic clutch was more difficult to keep in adjustment and was definitely higher maintenance than a freewheel unit. Buick quietly dropped the device after just 2 years. Many of you may remember the 1932 Buick, custom-built Buick town car that Odyssey Restorations restored and took to Pebble Beach. I forget the name of the owner.
Bidwell.
Yeah, Bidwell's car. That car had this Wizard Control on it, and Charlie Bidwell dug out some documentation on Wizard Control and how to maintain it, so that's where I got some of this information.
So I have a question, Barney.
Yes.
The freewheel, can you give us an example of like, probably most of us know how standard transmission goes when you're driving it.
Okay.
So can you give us an example of how that,
It would
if
be
you're
just,
driving and they use the freewheel, how does that go?
if you are familiar with a manual transmission car and have driven that, it would be like every time you took your foot off the gas, you pushed in the clutch and just coasted. That's what freewheeling did.
Well, isn't that similar to the...
That's not what, if you don't push the clutch in, then the engine provides braking to the car. It will slow you down faster than if you just coasted. You should try that sometime. Have you got a manual shift car now?
What? I'm sorry.
Have you got a car with a manual shift now?
Packard.
Packard.
She drove the Packard in the Southdale Mall lot last Sunday morning.
Well, I'm sure.
Breakthrough, but no freewheeling.
I don't understand the freewheeling.
Randy will let you probably take the Packard out for some experimental drives.
I'm encouraging it.
So, you don't.
Brakes on that.
It's coast. You understand about coasting?
Yeah.
The only way you coast is either put the transmission in neutral or to push in the clutch, or both.
Right.
And that's what freewheeling did, just automatically. But then when you step on the gas, then it would engage again, because the engine speed would then come up to a greater speed than the drive shaft speed, as interpreted by the transmission. This is getting confusing.
Going down a hill with that.
Oh yeah, it was dangerous. No engine braking.
Oh, okay.
Imagine Ramsey Hill with freewheeling. Well, so some of these ideas, like synchromesh and helical gears, which I haven't talked about, but became permanent fixtures in the automobile industry. Best to give emphasis to my remarks. I'll try to avoid doing that. Other things like automatic clutches and freewheeling went away and they have not come back. But there was wide recognition in the industry. These things did prove one thing, that these devices fell far short of the real goal, which would be a fully automatic transmission. So efforts to develop an automatic transmission were going on full blast within the industry and of course by any number of eager inventors outside of Detroit's engineering departments. Public interest was growing. Devices to make shifting easier had been explored. Now the time had come to take steps to seriously reduce the amount of gear shift. The challenge boiled down to meeting two objectives. Now, again, I encourage you to ask me to fully develop these. The first challenge was developing a reliable means to permit the engine to idle in gear, yet pull the car when the engine was accelerated without any driver action other than pressing the accelerator. To do it, up to this point, you had to not only step on the gas, you had to let out the clutch. You had to select a gear to drive away in. To make a fully automatic transmission, you had to have something that would just permit a driver to sit there, fat, dumb, and happy, press on the gas and go. That's the first requirement. The second requirement is a transmission had to be developed that would shift under load. In other words, all the shifting we do on a manual shift car, we let up in the gas to let the engine take a rest for a minute. We push in the clutch and move the gear shift lever, and then we let the clutch out and bring the engine up to speed. To be a fully automatic transmission had to be able to shift under load without letting up on the gas. In other words, the driver had to be able to, I mean, this is the goal that the engineers were trying to achieve. Step on the gas and then have any shifting that the transmission did all entirely up to the transmission. Nothing the driver had to do to say what gear to go in. That was the objective. And they achieved it. We'll hear more about that in just a minute. There was another Buick sidebar I should mention to you because it was kind of significant. Buick was an important manufacturer, had been ever since 1910 when it became one of the founding unit of General Motors. So Buick was an important manufacturer, and they went to a lot of effort, spent millions of dollars in the early 30s to develop an automatic transmission. Years of work and millions of dollars went into development of what came to be called the roller transmission. But in the end, when it was ready for production, about 1935, the project was canceled by Alfred Sloan, the chairman of the board, no less, of General Motors. There were several reasons. The transmission weighed 3 times as much as a manual transmission. It added a good $500 to the cost of the car, which was about half the price of, a Buick could be bought in about 1933 for maybe $1,000 to $1,200, and had not shown good reliability. It was a continuously or infinitely variable friction transmission with an automatic clutch to permit idling. They called it the roller transmission. There was no fluid coupling, we'll more about that in a minute, as became common in later automatics. The prototypes gave good performance in tests, but costs and doubts about longevity doomed it. It was not until the end of the 20th century that Audi was finally successful in bringing an automatic transmission to market based on similar principles. They call it a CVT transmission. That's the buzzword today. The recent Ford 500 and Freestyle cars were built with an Audi-sourced CVT transmission as standard equipment for a couple of years before they basically went back to the drawing board and said, this is not quite ready for prime time. But that's the idea. No fluids involved. It's hydraulically actuated, and it's continuously variable. Well, Buick got, they aspired to this. Well, we'll talk about that in a minute. I will pass on overdrive because that wasn't an automatic, but overdrive came in about 1936 and was popular on many cars through the 40s and into the 50s. It provided a 4th gear higher than the normal 3rd gear in the car, the normal high gear in the car. It also provided freewheeling at low speeds, and it was quite a trouble-free and useful device. It saved mileage and gave a driver who cared to utilize its capabilities some extra options. Also in the middle of the 30s, Rio Motor Company, the car builder and later a truck builder, developed a self-shifter transmission, which eliminated the gear shift lever, but not the clutch pedal. They spent a lot of money to develop it. They hoped to sell the device to other car makers, but nobody bought it. By 1936, Rio decided to quit making cars. So that was a failure. But it was the first primitive effort to develop an automatic transmission. Even before Buick gave up on the roller transmission, work was underway at General Motors on another type of automatic, first at Cadillac Division and later at Oldsmobile. This effort started in 1932 and was really a GM project. It was directed by none other than Earl Thompson, who you will remember was the inventor of synchromesh gears. By 1934, Thompson and his group had a transmission that would shift under full torque load, that is, full pressure from full acceleration by the engine, without letting up on the engine throttle. Prototype transmissions were turned over to Oldsmobile in 1935 and 1936 for testing. This led to the June 1937 introduction of what Olds called the automatic safety transmission. They called it the safety transmission because the driver didn't have to take his hands off the wheel to shift gears. Clutching at straws. It was an option on the 1937 Oldsmobile 8-cylinder cars. This was the true forerunner of hydromatic transmission and incorporated many of its principles. The automatic safety transmission used 2 planetary gear sets in the gearbox, which would become a key feature in the design of hydromatic, and later automatics as well. Planetary gears were used in the Ford Model T transmission. It incorporates a, don't feel you have to get this figured out, because I haven't quite figured it out yet myself. There's a ring gear with teeth on the inside of the ring, and then there's a sun gear in the middle, so-called, because it's at the center of the organ. And these 2 sets of gears are tied together by planetary gears. And take my word for this, you can change the ratio by how those gear trains are hooked up with other gears in the transmission, and by whether you put the brakes on this ring gear to stop it, then it forces the gears to follow a different path. So through that device, they could change ratios, and they could shift under load. These gears are always in mesh, and shifts are effected by clamping a band around the outside of the ring gear to stop it from rotation. In the Model T, the driver used foot pedals to apply the bands or release them. In the automatic safety transmission and subsequent automatics, hydraulics provide the muscle. The automatic safety transmission still required a clutch pedal, but it was only used for starting, stopping, and reversing. And the transmission did not have a gear shift lever as such. It was more like a modern automatic transmission selector lever. You flicked it between a couple of switch positions on the quadrant. But once you got underway, the transmission then shifted under load automatically. But it still was a kind of a bit of monkey business, because you had to remember to push the clutch in when you came to a stop, and you shifted into reverse, things like that. But it was a true 4-speed transmission, and flooring the accelerator would downshift to 3rd gear for passing or extra acceleration. The new transmission worked fine, although it apparently was seldom ordered. I couldn't find out any production figures, but it was an option on all Oldsmobiles in 1938 and in 1939, and it was briefly made an option on Buick Specials in 1938. But Buick engineers were very reluctant about this, unhappy about this. I think they were still kind of miffed because Sloan had turned down their roller transmission, which they had developed independently. Well, after 1939, the automatic safety transmission was discontinued because the next year would see the introduction of hydromatic. There was a side benefit to the automatic safety transmission. It was the elimination of the shift lever from the center of the front seat floor. You remember, up to this time, there was a big gear shift lever sticking out of the floor, and if you sat in the middle of the front seat, the gear lever would be between your legs or bumping your knees. So that was 3 people could now occupy the front seat more comfortably. 1938 was the year the gear shift lever began its migration from the floor to the steering